Hello children, let us revise the parts of a flower. That is, there was the stalk called pedicel, then green leaves, sepals, and the whole whorl is called calyx. The colored leaves, petals, and the whole whorl is called corolla. Then the male part of the flower called stamen and the female part called carpel. The stamen consists of a stalk called filament and the anther-lobes. Inside these anther-lobes, the cell division meiosis takes place and the male sex cells, that is pollen grains, are formed. Now, the female part of the flower is the carpel or pistil, which consists of stigma, style, and ovary. Inside the ovary are present ovules, these structures, and inside ovule is present female sex cell, that is the egg cell. Let us draw the diagram of ovule and see its parts. An ovule consists of 2 to 3 protective layers which are called integuments. As you can see, these integuments, they are not complete. They leave a aperture in between. They cover the whole ovule, leaving a aperture. These two protective layers, 2 or 3 they can be, these are called integuments. The tissue enclosed inside the integuments is called nucellus. Tissue enclosed is called nucellus. The end of the ovule where this pore is not present, or end of the ovule opposite to the pore, this end is called chalaza, or simply the chalazal end. This pore is called micropyle. Inside the nucellus is present embryo sac. Inside the nucellus is present embryo sac. Inside embryo sac there are present 7 cells. 3 at this end, micropylar end, and 3 at the chalazal end. Actually, there were 4 cells at each end, one end from this chalazal end, one cell from chalazal end, and one cell from the micropylar end. They move to the center. एक यहाँ से आएगा, एक यहाँ से इस end से आएगा. They will come in center and they will fuse to form a cell which is called polar nuclei or secondary nucleus. These ends at the micropylar end, center wala jo hai, that is the egg cell, which is the female sex cell. The remaining 2 cells, ये वाले जो 2 हैं हमारे पास इस end पे, these 2 are called synergids, and the 3 cells at the chalazal end, these are called antipodal cells. So, ovule consists of the protective membranes which are called integuments. These integuments cover the ovule from all sides, leaving a part, and that part or aperture is called micropyle. The end opposite to the micropyle is called chalazal end, or simply chalaza. The tissue inside the integuments or tissue enclosed by the integuments is called nucellus. Inside the nucellus is present embryo sac, this structure. Inside embryo sac there are present 7 cells, 3 at the micropylar end and 3 at chalazal end. At the micropylar end, the central cell is egg cell. The other 2 cells are called synergids. 3 at the chalazal end, they are antipodal. And in the center, there is a fused cell which is called secondary nucleus or the polar nuclei. This is the structure of ovule. Now, the next topic is pollination. What do we mean by pollination? These are the stamens, and this is what a carpel is shown in a flower. Stamens and the carpel shown. Stamens and the carpel shown. Pollen grains are formed inside these anther lobes. Pollen grains, that is the male sex cells, they are formed inside the anther lobes. For sexual reproduction to take place, these pollen grains, they must reach to the stigma. This is the first step. They must reach to the stigma, and from stigma they will enter inside the carpel and they will travel through this path and ultimately they will meet the egg cell inside the ovule. ये जो हमने structure बनाया है, this ovule, many such ovules are present inside the ovary. Now, the transfer of pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the carpel. This process is called pollination. Transfer of pollen grains from stamen to the stigma of the carpel is called pollination. Now, pollination is of 2 types. Say this is a plant, same plant पे 2 flowers हैं. If the transfer of pollen grains takes place from the stamen to the stigma of the carpel within the same flower, उसी फूल में ही ट्रांसफर हो गए. From the stamen to the stigma within the same flower, this is called self-pollination. This is also the transfer of pollen grain take place from the stamen to the stigma within the same flower. This is also self-pollination. If the transfer of pollen grains takes place from one flower to another but within the same plant, ये pollen grain इसके यहाँ transfer हो गए. If the transfer of pollen grains takes place from the stamen to the stigma, from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but within the same plant, this is also called self-pollination. But if the transfer of pollen grains takes place from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant, then it is called क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. यानी अगर pollen grain ट्रांसफर होते हैं from one flower to another flower but within the same plant, it is self pollination. If the pollen grains are transferred from the stamen to the carpel but within the same flower, again it is self pollination. But if the pollen grains, they are transferred from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant, then it is called cross pollination.